If you have a Bible and you find it helpful to follow along, please turn it to James 1, which you may think is a very curious text for the first Sunday of Advent. That's okay. I'll try my best to satisfy your curiosity if you have any by the time I'm done here today. Yes, sir.
This is what Tyler talked about James last week.
Did he really? How about that? I wish I had. Did anybody record that, by the way? I think I asked Brad to record Tyler last week. Did anybody record it? Maybe Tyler did. I'll check with him and see if he did. He may have set his phone up here and done it.
It was good.
Thank you. I'm glad it was.
Oh, of course.
I really am glad it was. Well, anyhow, in James, what you find here is a rather curious text. And the reason it's curious is because James makes use of two devices that we use in communication. Is it chilly in here to you, Tina? I'll adjust it. One is known as an epigram. An epigram is a literary device, very simple thing. Let me give you one. We aren't sinners because we sin. We sin because we're sinners. That's an epigram. You take two thoughts and you kind of plug them together, and by virtue of the fact that they differ, you make a third point that is stronger than the one thing would be if I just said we sin because we're sinners. It wouldn't have the impact. That's an epigram. G.K. Chesterton, if you read Chesterton, any book he writes is practically, every paragraph has at least several epigrams within it. He's the master of the epigram, which is what makes his writing so interesting to read. I would encourage anybody who's looking for something to read that will keep them occupied for quite some time to read orthodoxy. A paradox is related to the epigram. That's where you take something that looks apparent to us in one way, but if you think about it, there's a tension there. And within James, here's a paradox. Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. It is God who works in you to bring about his goodwill and pleasure. So which is it? There's a paradox there. It's both things, and they're in tension, and we just have to accept that they are. Peter said to the crowd in his first sermon, "This man whom God foreordained, whom you crucified." So you've got God's sovereignty and personal responsibility in the same sentence. That's a paradox as well. In both cases, they are utilized to make truths apparent to us that wouldn't be apparent had the paradox or the epigram not been there. We would just forget it. That's why Jesus taught the way he did. He gave people things that they could remember without having them written down. With that in mind, let's look at James chapter 1. I'll begin reading in verse 1. From James, is this what Tyler took as a text? No.
He just told us to go home and read it.
Okay. Well, maybe everybody did. From James, a slave of God and the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes dispersed abroad, greetings. My brothers and sisters, consider it nothing but joy when you fall into all sorts of trials, because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect effect, so that you will be perfect and complete, not being deficient in anything. If anyone is deficient in wisdom, they should ask God, who gives to all generously without reprimand, and wisdom will be given. But they must ask in faith without doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed about by the wind. For that person must not suppose they will receive anything from the Lord, since they are double-minded as an individual, unstable in all their ways. We don't want to be unstable in all our ways. Now, the believer of humble means should take pride in their high position. But the rich person's pride should be in their humiliation, because they will pass away like a wildflower in a meadow. Sun rises with its heat. It dries up the meadow. The petal of the flower falls off, and its beauty is lost forever. So the rich person, in the midst of their pursuits, will wither away. Happy is the one who endures testing, because when they have proven to be genuine, they will receive the crown of life that God promised to those who love him. Let no one say when they are tempted, I'm being tempted by God, for God tempts no one, and he himself is tempted by no one. But each one is tempted when they are lured and enticed by their own desires. Then, When desire conceives, it gives birth to sin. And when sin is full grown, it gives birth to death. Do not be led astray, my brothers and sisters. All generous giving and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, in whom there is no variation or the slightest hint of change. By his sovereign plan, he gave us birth through the message of truth, that we would be a kind of first fruits of everything he created. Now, there are probably 5 sermons in this text, and I can't do but one today. But when we read a text like this, the very first question we should ask, if we're going to do biblical interpretation such that the Bible really is understood in the way that it was written, is to say, who's this written to? Who is James writing to? James is writing, it says it in the first part of the text. He is writing to Jews who have become followers of the Jewish Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth, who are scattered all over the Roman Empire. That's who he's writing to. Why is he writing to them in the way that he does? That's a historical question. The historical question is answered by doing any study of the history of Judaism in the first century in the Roman Empire, and you will find that the Jews who converted to following the Jewish Messiah Jesus found themselves in a dire situation because they were attacked on 2 fronts. The Jews weren't particularly liked by the Romans. The Romans, in not liking the Jews, they certainly didn't like the followers of the Jewish Messiah doubly as much. And the ones who followed the Jewish Messiah as Jews, who became completed Jews, were also disliked by the Jews. So they really had no friends when you come down to it. Think of it this way. Imagine being, here's a modern example that's perfectly applicable. Imagine being a born-again follower of Jesus as a Palestinian living in Gaza. That's exactly what's going on here. That's why James writes this way. You see, if you know anything, for instance, about, say, Mormonism, and you move to Salt Lake City because you've got a job there, be aware. There are lots of things that will happen to you as a non-Mormon where you'll be excluded, overlooked, things will not necessarily getting the same police protection. All of this is happening to the Palestinian Christians who are in Gaza. First place, the inhabitants of Gaza ruled by Hamas are all Muslims. So if you're a Christian, you're an infidel. An infidel is a second-class citizen in any Muslim country or nation or city. And by virtue of that, if your house is broken into, the police might come and investigate it. They might not. And you've really got nothing to say about it. You will also pay what's known as the jizya, that is the infidel tax, that a Muslim doesn't have to pay. So this is the plight of the Jewish Christian in the first century in the Roman Empire. The Jews don't like them. The Orthodox Jews don't like them. The non-converted Jews. The Gentiles don't like them because they're Jewish, and the Roman Empire doesn't like them because of everything. So they're just stuck. So he writes to them in this way. And that's why he says to them in this first epigram, he says it this way, it's translated this way, literally. Let the poor brag in their height. Now that to me is just a complete epigrammatic paradox in that way. How is it, if I try to place myself in a position of being this person to whom James is writing in the first century. Yes, that might encourage me today, but I'm going to get up in the morning and face all of the same difficulties that I was facing before I read it. And those difficulties are not going to go away. They're going to be there for me as a converted Jew in the Roman Empire. So in some ways, it almost feels cruel, like a taunt almost. What's he getting at here? Well, how are the poor lifted up? What he's getting at here is something we spoke about on Wednesday night, and I think we spoke about it a bit in Sunday school last Sunday, Sunday before last, if I'm not mistaken, if my memory serves me. And that is, what's the difference between being earthly minded and heavenly minded? James is trying to encourage these Jews who are converted to Christianity to say, look, the world looks like it does, but you need to be thinking about the next world, not this one so much, and be encouraged in that. It's a very difficult place, but think of it also, if a person is deeply in poverty, who's a believer, and there are lots of them, who do they look to? In other words, they are there with empty hands and are easily then rewarded by God. Easily. We have food today. God is good. You can imagine how that kind of thinking starts to permeate a person who really doesn't have anything. So what he's trying to do is get people to be heavenly minded. What is the purpose for all the sentimentality surrounding Advent? For us. To make us heavenly minded. That's exactly what it's for. How are the rich then poor? Think of that for just a moment. James is really rough on these guys, it seems to me, in this passage. But think of it this way. Again, it goes right back to heavenly mindedness. I read of a general who was at one of these bibulous dinners, state dinners, where you have 4 forks and a couple of spoons and 2 or 3 knives, and they bring the first course out, and it's a big plate with a little pile of food right in the middle that's decorated nicely. You eat that, and then they bring you another one, and you sit through it. So they're sitting there, this army chaplain and a general are at the table together, and the general wants to make conversation, so he looks over at the chaplain, he says, "Pastor, can you tell me something certain about heaven?" Chaplain thinks for just a minute, says, "Sure." He says, "You won't be a general there." Right? Everybody's going to be the same. Jesus will be the only general there is, and all of us will simply be there together. So it's an absolutely right statement about what heaven's going to be like. So James, in some way, is trying to get the rich in this text, the rich to whom he writes, to think of themselves in this way. This poor person you're looking at, you're nothing beyond them. When you all stand before Jesus, you're going to be the same. You'll be different people, but you'll be the same. Nobody will be lifted out, in other words. And he almost makes the case that the wealthy should fear their wealth. Now, the part of this text that I find most disturbing is that every person who's seated in this room right now is rich, including me. We have more in the most impoverished people in this country than 7/8 of the rest of the world. I don't know if you're aware of that, economically speaking. I mean, you and I can say, where do we want to eat? 7/8 of the world can't do that. You and I can say, where do we want to go? I remember before we had kids, of course, once you have children, the question of what do you want to do today is totally wiped off the board. But once you have the children, you know what you're going to be doing all day, at least one of you. And maybe you'll trade off who's going to be with the kid and entertain the child all day long, or the children. Well, I remember when Becky and I didn't have children, and we would wake up on a Saturday and think, what do you want? What's on your slate today? Well, I don't know. What do you want to do? Well, 7/8 of the world doesn't have that option at all. So who is James writing to when we read this? He's writing to you and me. This, again, goes right back to Advent. What is the purpose for the Advent in terms of how it makes us want to live? It makes us heavenly minded. Heavenly minded. You see, the practical value is here for the rich. Let's just be honest with ourselves. The rich, you and me, are pretty focused on this earth and the things in it. We are. I'm not trying to make anybody feel bad. I mean, I'm the same way. What kind of car are we going to replace this one with? Those kinds of questions. You know, does the house need to be painted? All of those kinds of first world problems that we have. We're focused on the earth. We have a kind of a hurdle that we have to overcome in order to maintain a heavenly minded condition. We have to. We have to almost ignore things in order to have that. The poor don't have that problem. God, please help us make it through this day. It's a very different attitude. I'm not trying to condemn anybody because I'm sitting where you are. So please don't mishear me. And I don't want anybody to feel bad. I'm just saying, Advent and all of the sentimentality attached to it is there for a reason. It's there to change us. It's not there to just feel the sentimentality and walk away. Now there's also then this text, and this is curious to me. This is why I say there are probably 3 or 4 sermons in this one text. James then talks about doubt. Right? He couples these two things and it's one big thought. Why is that? What is the deal here with doubt? This, I think, you'll find very encouraging because it certainly encourages me. A lot of believers walk through this world with this attitude, or this, not an attitude, this mindset. Good times means God is pleased with me. Hard times or bad times means God is not pleased. I spoke to somebody this week, follower of Jesus, no doubt about it, firmly believes that that's how things are. Now, I'm not saying they aren't ever that way. I think God can use all kinds of things to steer us in the direction he would like for us to go. But to have this absolute fixated notion that good times means God is pleased with me and bad times means God is not pleased with me doesn't fit this text at all. Not even close. It's not that way. There's an advantage, I think, in seeing things that way because everything becomes really simple, right? We don't have to think much when we come into difficulty in our lives. But the modern North American Christianity notions all break down with a text like this one. We interpret life in the opposite of this passage many, many times. There's a Christian philosopher you may have never heard of. I didn't hear of him until about a decade ago, called Miguel Unamuno. Miguel Unamuno. Really profound writer. He wrote from the middle of the 19th century to the early 20th. He was a Christian, a very devout Christian, almost a mystic, and he says this. This is very profound. Listen very carefully if you can. Those who believe that they believe in God, but without passion in their hearts, without anguish in their minds, without some uncertainty and without doubt, without an element of despair, even in their consolation, believe only in the God idea, not in God himself. Wow. Man, if ever there was a convicting statement, that's one. In other words, if we aren't moving through this world, this is something that for me, maybe I'm the only one in the room for whom this is just a violent peeve, but it's violently peevish for me. Anytime I get into a congregational setting, a meeting, whatever it is, and I get somebody in front of me who does what I'm doing in front of you and says to me, I don't ever doubt, and if you doubt, there's something wrong with you. And I've heard that said many, many, many times. Many times. And I just think, gosh, one thing I know for sure, just like the chaplain was sure that the general would no longer be a general, I'm certain that person has just lied to themselves and everybody else in the room, without a doubt. I don't doubt that, even for a second. I mean, think about it. We sit here on Wednesday nights or in Sunday school, and we take a verse of Scripture, or we take something that Lewis has written applied to a verse of Scripture, and we wrangle over the issues that are surrounding things that we say we believe. Why would we wrangle about it if we had no doubt? Right? If there's no doubt about any of this stuff, then there's nothing to talk about, is there? Why do we need to be encouraged? Why do we need sermons? Why do we need songs? Why do we need Sunday school? Why do we need books? Why do we need anything? Why do we need a Bible, for that matter, if there's no doubt? Any person who says they don't experience doubt ever has deceived themselves without any doubt. Without any doubt. James is reminding us here that doubt and temptation are not God's doing. That's all. He's not saying that doubt is necessarily sinful. He's simply saying God's not the author of it. But we're fallen flesh. I'm trapped in time, aren't you? And for me, I can't look ahead and say let me just set this out before you. If somebody asks me, Rip, do you know that God exists? I would say, I believe he does. That's what I would say. And I believe it as certainly as I believe anything else in this world. I believe it as certainly as I believe that I'm here. But that's the best I can say. I believe it. Jesus was so clear. Blessed are they who have not seen and yet believe. There's a reason for that. We're exercising something that is not a default position necessarily. And God rewards that exercise by making his presence known to us in ways that is as certain as you and I can know anything at all. So when we endure temptation, James is telling us when we endure hardship, there's a blessing involved in it. God is going to reward it. And that's going to, if we see the world that way, we're becoming heavenly minded. Heavenly minded. Then he goes into this discussion of sin. Now, I want to relate this to you for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's something that actually happened to me, and it occurred to me this is just like how sin works. Think of it this way. If you go to one of these big theme parks, I like a roller coaster where on the first hill, I'm already fearful that I'm not going to live through the ride. That's the kind of roller coaster I want to be on. And when I get off, I want my brain to be so addled that I'm kind of wobbly when I step back on terra firma. Those are the kinds of roller coasters I like. Well, we were in SeaWorld once, and Jackson was about 9 years old. Well, Jackson was 5 feet tall already. So he could ride anything he wanted at 9 years old. Didn't matter. You got the little scale over there. If you're above this line, you can ride. They were testing a new ride at SeaWorld called the Manta Ray. And that meant there was nobody in line. But this is the way sin works. Think, okay, on a normal day, I see the Manta Ray and I think, boy, that looks fun. You hear people go up to the top screaming as they come back down. I think that's the ride for me. So there's usually a line outside the building. So you get in that line. But if you decide, and let's equate the ride with sin. I don't think it's sinful, but let's equate it just metaphorically if we can. Okay, so you're standing outside the building and you decide, I just don't want to ride it. So you get out of line. It's easy, right? Then you get inside the building, you get in that serpentine line. So now if you'd say to yourself, I think I don't want to ride this, now it's going to be harder to get out of line. It's going to be harder to extricate yourself from the ride because you got to shimmy past 30 or 40 people who are irritated with you and the fact some of them holding drinks and everything else, babies, whatever they're doing. And so it's irritating. It's harder to get away from the ride. Then you get up to the ride and they put you in the seat. If you want to get out now, you're going to inconvenience a lot of people, right? Because they got to hold everything up, get you back out of the seat. You're in the ride, and that thing comes down over you, and these rides that take you upside down and backwards in all sorts of ways, and it goes click. And now you're in. So to get out now is going to be very difficult. And once that sucker starts moving, you're not getting off. You're caught in the sin, right? I'll never forget this as long as I live. We got on this thing, and the buckles came down, and Jackson, he's just smiling like a billy goat eating stickers. He's just got a huge grin on his face. He's all excited. And then after the thing goes click, the seats tip down where we're facing the dirt. And Jackson looks over at me and says, he's no longer smiling. The smile's gone. He's dead. Do you think we should do this? We're doing it now. We're on the ride. We're not going to get off. That's what sin is like. James says it's awakened in the imagination. It's fed by the desires, and then the desires create the movement of the will, and we sin. That's exactly just like being in that line. It gets harder and harder and harder to avoid it. The Christian life is hard for you and me. Harder, I'm going to say this without any hesitation. It is harder for us than it is for a person who has nothing. Because we have to overcome things just to hang in there. The person who has nothing is simply dependent on God. They don't have to overcome anything. They just depend on him for everything. And it's hard for us because we're happy. That's what makes it hard. That's why we have these discussions. I guarantee you a person who is looking to God for the very sustenance of that day, they're not having discussions about theology. They're just asking God to help them. So I want us to, if you can place yourself, if I can place myself in the condition of remembering being born again, what that was like. It was awesome when it first happened. You just wake up and you think, wow, everything's better. The sky is bluer, the grass is greener, work is easier, everything's just wonderful. C.S. Lewis equates the Christian life as a house being built. And he says, when you're first born again, God comes in with a paintbrush and just does a bunch of cosmetic stuff and makes everything nicer, vacuums and dusts, cleans up, maybe puts some potpourri on the stove so everything smells nice. But then all of a sudden, after you've been a believer for a little while, stuff starts to hurt because God starts knocking down the walls and putting additions on the house and all kinds of things. Why? Because God, living in you and me as the house God lives within, is not satisfied with just a little cottage. He's building a palace. And things have to be torn out for him to make the palace as he would see it to be. That's what being a Christian is like. So James is describing for us the situation, the state of affairs of being torn down and being rebuilt. And it's to bring us to that place that James says, so that we'll be complete, lacking in nothing. God entered into humanity. Advent is the story of God entering into humanity so that we could be bought back and built for heaven. That's what the Advent is. And James does a pretty good job of describing the purpose for it right here in this text. I don't know where everybody is, but if I've said anything that you got a question about, you want to pray with me, I'll stay as long as it takes as we close.
Page 86.
I'm sorry.